Good afternoon, my name is Amy Weber, and this is my generational narrative assignment. The two people I chose to interview for this assignment are Mary Catherine Fleming, my grandmother-in-law, and Catherine Ann Fleming, my mother-in-law. I would first like to give a little bit of background information about each of the people I interviewed. Mary Catherine Fleming was an only child, born May 22, 1930 in Fall Branch, Tennessee, to Annie and Dana Bacon. Her mother, Annie, was postmaster at Fall Branch Post Office, and her father, Dana, was a farmer. She went to school at East Tennessee State College, where she received her teaching certificate. She was a substitute teacher for about a year before she got married and started having children. Catherine Ann Fleming was the second of four children, born July 23, 1954, in Kingsport, Tennessee at Wellmont Hospital, to Mary Catherine and Roy Fleming. Her father, Roy, was a civil engineer and retired from Eastman Chemical Company. She has taken courses of interest off and on, but has not yet conferred a degree. She currently works as a caretaker for a disabled gentleman. I asked both of these ladies a series of 10 questions regarding aspects of diversity and prejudice. As we go through these 10 questions, it's very interesting to notice the differences in their answers between the generations. The first question I asked was, as a child, do you recall an adult ever discussing prejudice with you, and if so, what were you told? Mary Catherine said the discussion of prejudice just didn't happen in her household. Things were the way her parents said and no discussion was allowed. She can't recall the word prejudice ever being used. Catherine Ann recalls her father having discussed people who were different than her, but the word prejudice was never used. He only said that there were people who were different than her, and each of them deserved respect. I found these responses to be very telling about the times in which these ladies grew up in. Mary Catherine's generation was more hush-hush and not accepting. Even if there was an issue, you didn't talk about it. Whereas Catherine Ann's generation, things were starting to get talked about a little bit more. The second question I asked was as follows. Sometimes people will tell children one thing but model another. Did you pick up on any unwritten rules from the adults in your life about how to interact with those who were different than you? Mary Catherine recalls how she was supposed to act was certainly modeled, especially by her mother, who she remembers as being very class conscious. Catherine Ann, on the other hand, remembers an instance in high school where prejudice was modeled by a first-grade teacher for whom she was a student worker. I'm going to share a couple of stories with you that Mary Catherine and Catherine Ann shared with me regarding prejudice. The first story is with Mary Catherine and deals with her mother in regards to being class conscious. There was a street just off Main Street on the edge of town in Fall Branch where Mary Catherine grew up, where most of the poor people lived. Her mother told her that under any circumstances she was not to go up there. Didn't give an explanation as to why, just that she wasn't allowed. For Catherine Ann, her story is when she was a junior in high school and she was a student worker for a first-grade teacher. The teacher would put all of the poorer students in the back of the room on their own table, and when Catherine Ann would need to go help them, she would always tell her, "Now, Catherine Ann, when you go to help these students, you take your own pencil, because they're too dirty. You don't want to use their pencils." The next question I asked was, can you recall one of the first times that you encountered someone who was different than you, and what was your reaction? Mary Catherine stated that she recalls her first encounter with someone who was different quite well. She remembers feeling sorry for the little boy as he had to sleep on the floor by the fireplace. I'll expound on that in just a moment. Catherine Ann also remembers her first encounter very well, as it was someone in her own home. Her feelings towards her brother remained unchanged even after she found out how he was different from her. I'm going to share with you now the story that Mary Catherine shared with me about the first time she encountered someone who was different from her, or at least the first time that she can remember growing up. She was visiting her grandfather, who was a morbidly obese man, and he had a little black slave boy that was in charge of helping him onto his horse because he was so large, mending his socks, mending his pants, fixing his food, things of that nature. She remembers that the little slave boy slept on the floor in the kitchen by the fireplace. My next question was thinking back over your life, can you identify any events that happened on a national or regional level that influenced your thinking about prejudice or about other groups of people in general? Mary Catherine stated that she couldn't recall any national or regional influences, as Fall Branch is such a little town. She didn't think it would have had much influence anyway. Catherine Ann said looking back, she was unable to recall any specific regional events, but just rather that prejudice seemed to be the rule rather than the exception. I found Mary Catherine's response to be rather interesting, how she thought Fall Branch was such a small town that any national influence wouldn't have made it there anyway. Isn't that kind of interesting? The next question I asked of these two ladies was, what about personal events? Were there any personal events that may have influenced your thinking in regards to discrimination or prejudice? Mary Catherine stated that the class consciousness of her mother did extend into her own life for a time. However, she was able to overcome this prejudice after marrying her husband Roy. Catherine Ann couldn't recall any personal events that may have influenced her thinking, at least not in a bad way. I'll expound on that in just a moment. When Mary Catherine spoke to me about her life not being influenced by someone else, at least not in a bad way, she was speaking of her father. He had a great influence on her life and how she perceived diversity and how she perceived prejudice. It just wasn't in a bad outcome. We'll get into more detail of that here in just a couple of questions. My next question was, what have you told your children about prejudice? Mary Catherine stated, despite her being raised in a rather prejudiced and discriminatory home, she feels as though she has portrayed an accepting attitude towards her children and hoped to teach them to do the same. Catherine Ann taught her children to be a welcoming person to all races, both sexes, and regardless of social wealth status or personal beliefs. In regards to this question, I thought it would be wise to enter in a little bit of personal experience. As I have married Mary Catherine's son, I've been around this family a great deal, and what a diverse group of people it is. For instance, myself and Mary Catherine, my husband's grandmother, are Christians. My mother-in-law, Catherine Ann, is Wiccan. My husband's uncle, Mary Catherine's brother, is a homosexual, and my husband is an atheist. Yet, we get around the lunch table every Sunday. We talk with each other, we have lots of fun, and everybody's beliefs are welcome at the table. My next question was, do you think that the problem of prejudice in the United States has improved, grown worse, or stayed the same in your lifetime? How have things changed, and how have things stayed the same? Mary Catherine feels as though prejudice in the United States has improved in her lifetime a great deal. People have become more accepting of others, not just tolerant. The rural areas, like Fall Branch, still have lingering prejudice, even if it's not spoken of. Catherine Ann also feels as though prejudice in the United States has improved in her lifetime. She feels as though there is still work to be done. I would have to agree with Catherine Ann on this aspect. I feel that prejudice has come a long way. However, there's always work to be done. There's constantly stories in the news of prejudice going on, whether it's at schools, whether it's race, whether it's sexuality choice, religion. We have come a long way as a nation, but we still have a lot more work to do. The next question I asked these two ladies was, who do you believe had the most influence on your views about diversity? Mary Catherine stated that there were 3 people who influenced her diversity views a great deal. As a child, those people would have been her parents. Later in life, it was her husband. Catherine Ann cited her father as the greatest influence on her views of diversity. She recalls him being one of the people in the community that would lend money to someone even if he knew that they wouldn't be able to pay him back. I find it wonderful that Roy Fleming was able to greatly influence both of these ladies' lives when it comes to diversity and prejudice. Unfortunately, he passed away before I ever got to meet him, but I have heard and I feel as though he was a wonderful man. My next question was, what, if anything, do you believe is your responsibility in combating prejudice? Mary Catherine feels at this stage in her life she's too old to have much responsibility in combating prejudice. She feels that's for the younger ones to take care of now. Catherine Ann feels a personal responsibility to ensure that she is fair and unbiased with anyone she comes in contact with. Although she's just one person, she feels each and every person can make a difference. I too feel as though each person can make a difference, and we have a moral responsibility to do so. Anytime we see someone that is a victim of prejudice or a diversity issue, we should do what we can to help. My last question was, how do you believe that prejudice and discrimination should be handled in the future in the United States? Mary Catherine stated she feels as though prejudice and discrimination should be handled in a delicate manner without ever causing too much of a ruckus. Catherine Ann stated, as an extremely independent and headstrong person, she feels as though each person has a responsibility to address any prejudices seen and make an effort to correct it. In the case of Mary Catherine, it seems as though old habits are hard to break. She grew up in a generation where things just weren't talked about if it was out of the norm. So now she still feels that way. Even if there is an issue, we should handle it delicately. We don't want to ruffle too many feathers. This assignment has been really fun and interesting for me. I enjoyed interviewing my mother-in-law and my grandmother-in-law. It was very interesting for me to see the differences in thoughts about prejudice and discrimination between the generations. I knew there would be a disparity between the two, but I didn't know that it would be as vast as it was. All in all, I had great fun. These ladies told me some wonderful stories, and I hope you enjoyed them as well.